They illegally tore down my fence, forgetting it was a protected landmark. What happens next will leave you speechless. The morning air was still, almost too still, as the heavy machinery rumbled to life. Mark could hear the deep, grumbling sound of the bulldozer's engine from his kitchen window, but it didn't register at first. The morning had been quiet, the kind of calm that typically followed a long stretch of stormy weather. His coffee sat untouched on the counter, steam rising lazily from the mug. He'd always appreciated the quiet mornings, a rare moment to breathe before the day fully began. But today something was different. The silence that had settled over the neighborhood felt oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Mark blinked, trying to shake the unease creeping up his spine. He took a sip of his coffee, hoping the warm liquid would settle his nerves. Didn't. His eyes wandered toward the window, drawn by the sound that had begun to resonate in his bones. There was something familiar about it, something that triggered a memory, something he couldn't quite place. And then, it hit him. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized the sound. The unmistakable growl of a bulldozer's engine. But why was it so close? Why was it running this early? He moved toward the window, coffee still in hand, his mind racing. His fingers tightened around the mug, knuckles turning white, as the bulldozer's engine continued to rumble. Closer now. Mark's gaze darted over the front yard, searching for the source of the noise, but it wasn't until he turned his focus toward the street that he saw it. The bulldozer was there, parked across the street at the edge of his property, the massive machine's mechanical arm raised high in the air. But that wasn't what caused Mark's heart to sink into his stomach. What caused his blood to freeze was the sight of his historic wooden fence, the one that had stood for over a century, the one that the entire neighborhood revered, being torn apart. Mark felt the air leave his lungs in a sharp rush. The bulldozer's arm swung down, and with a sickening crunch, the first beam of wood splintered beneath its heavy metal claws. The sound cut through the stillness like a knife, and Mark's chest tightened with a sudden, overwhelming wave of disbelief. No, this couldn't be happening. Not to his fence. Not to that piece of history. The bulldozer continued its relentless assault, tearing through the fence with brutal efficiency. Each movement was deliberate, each swing of the arm purposeful and controlled. Mark could hear the wood splintering, the nails protesting as they were ripped free from the weathered beams. His pulse quickened as he realized the enormity of what he was witnessing. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. Someone had ordered the destruction of his fence. He set his coffee down on the windowsill, though he couldn't remember doing so. He felt a coldness in his veins, a sinking sensation in his stomach, as the weight of the situation hit him. His mind raced with 100 different thoughts, but one stood out above the rest. Who could be behind this? Mark's eyes scanned the street, looking for any sign of who could be responsible. And that's when he saw her. Across the street, standing at the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn, was Karen. His stomach churned. The woman who ran the HOA, the woman who had made it her mission to control every aspect of the neighborhood, was standing there, watching. And there was something about her posture, something about the faint, almost imperceptible smile on her face, that told him she wasn't just watching. She was enjoying it. Mark's fists clenched, his body tensing with fury. He had known Karen for years, had watched as she wielded her position as HOA president like a weapon, using it to impose petty fines and rules on anyone she saw as a threat to her control. But this was beyond petty. This was destruction. And it wasn't just his fence she was attacking. It was his entire neighborhood. The history, the memories, everything that had been built here over the last century was being erased, all because she decided it didn't fit into her vision of what the neighborhood should be. Mark's throat tightened, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't bring himself to speak, couldn't find the words to express the depth of his anger, his frustration. It wasn't just the fence. It wasn't just the historical value. It was everything that fence represented. It was a symbol of the neighborhood, of the people who had lived here, of the unity they had once shared. And Karen, in her blind pursuit of power, was ripping it apart without a second thought. As the bulldozer's massive claw swung down again, Mark's hands trembled. This was the worst mistake she had ever made. He could feel it in his gut. This wouldn't end with just a destroyed fence. No, this would be the moment that unraveled everything. Karen had overplayed her hand, and she had no idea what was coming for her. He stormed out of the house, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He could hear the bulldozer in the distance, its destructive rhythm echoing in his ears as he rushed to the front yard. He didn't even notice the cool morning air against his skin, didn't feel the gravel crunching beneath his boots as he crossed his lawn. His eyes were fixed on Karen, who was still standing there, as calm and collected as ever, sipping her coffee like it was just another ordinary morning. When she saw him, she didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. Instead, her eyes met his with an almost casual indifference, and that faint smile remained on her lips. Mark's fury flared. "How could you?" He finally spat, his voice thick with disgust. "How could you do this?" Karen raised an eyebrow, almost as if she was mildly entertained by his reaction. She didn't seem fazed, didn't seem worried at all. Instead, she took another slow sip of her coffee, her gaze lingering on him with an unsettling calmness. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice too sweet, too practiced. "It's just a fence, Mark. It's time for some changes around here." It needed to go. Mark's jaw tightened. He knew Karen well enough to recognize the mask she wore, the innocent, disarming demeanor she used to manipulate people into thinking she had their best interests at heart. But Mark wasn't fooled. This wasn't about a fence. This wasn't about anything other than her unyielding need to control everything around her. "This is beyond just a fence, Karen," he said, his voice low, steady. "This is about your need to control. This is about your abuse of power. And I'm done letting you get away with it." Karen simply shrugged, unfazed. "You can't stop me, Mark. You never could." She turned away, walking back toward her house as though nothing had happened, leaving Mark standing in the street, seething with frustration and determination. But as he watched her retreat, he knew something she didn't. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The bulldozer continued its work behind him, but Mark didn't look back. His eyes were locked on the woman who had just made the worst mistake of her life. He had been patient, waiting for the right moment, watching for her to slip. Now finally she had, and Mark would make sure she paid for it. This wasn't just a fence. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Mark didn't know exactly how or when, but he knew one thing for sure. Karen's reign was coming to an end, and she had no idea just how badly she had underestimated him. With one final glance at the destruction she had caused, Mark turned away, his resolve hardening like steel. The storm was coming, and it was going to tear through Karen's world like the bulldozer had torn through his fence. She wouldn't see it coming, and when it hit, it would be everything she deserved. The morning air hung heavy with anticipation, the type of stillness that makes every sound feel louder than it should. Mark stood in his kitchen, staring at his half-filled coffee cup, the liquid no longer warm but forgotten in his hand. Outside, the sun hadn't quite broken through the clouds yet, casting the neighborhood in a muted light. The rhythmic rumble of a machine's engine broke the silence. It was faint at first, almost as if he could dismiss it, chalk it up to the sound of a distant construction site. But then it grew louder, nearer. His brow furrowed. He set the coffee down, the cup clinking softly against the ceramic saucer. For a moment, he remained still, unsure if he wanted to know what was happening outside. His pulse quickened as the sound of the machinery grew louder, its heavy vibrations making the windows tremble slightly. The bulldozer. He knew what it was before he even saw it. The unmistakable growl of the engine sent a chill down his spine. He moved toward the window, bracing himself for what was coming, but nothing could prepare him for what he saw. The sight was almost too much to process. His historic fence, the one that had been standing for over 100 years, was being torn apart. The bulldozer's massive arm swung down, tearing through the wood with ruthless precision. Mark's heart skipped a beat as the sound of splintering timber sliced through the air. a brutal assault on something that had meant so much to the community. The fence wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a piece of history. It had been a silent witness to generations of families, to milestones, to memories that were now being erased before his very eyes. Mark's breath hitched. His mind raced to catch up with the scene unfolding outside. The bulldozer's driver, a nameless figure behind the controls, showed no sign of stopping, the machine working with an almost mechanical efficiency. The fence, his fence, was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, as if it were little more than an inconvenience. Mark's stomach churned, but it was the face of the woman across the street that pushed him over the edge. Karen. She was standing there, just across the road, as though nothing out of the ordinary was happening. In her hand, a coffee mug dangled loosely, her fingers wrapped casually around the handle. Mark's eyes locked on hers. Her expression was serene, almost smug, as though she was watching a show rather than witnessing the destruction of something irreplaceable. She didn't flinch. Her lips curled into a small, almost satisfied smile. She hadn't just ordered the fence to be torn down. She had orchestrated it. Mark could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, coiling like a tight spring, ready to explode. The anger wasn't just for the fence, but for everything Karen represented. For years, she had made the lives of the residents a miserable cycle of rules and fines. A small infraction, a hedge that grew 2 inches too high, a mailbox placed a little too far from the curb, could bring the wrath of her power down like a hammer. She had made the neighborhood her own little fiefdom, and Mark had been one of her earliest victims. It had started with the hedge, but now it was something much bigger. This wasn't about a fence. It was about control, and Mark had had enough. Without a second thought, Mark stormed out of his house, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floorboards. The front door slammed shut behind him with a sharp crack, the sound sharp and final. As he crossed his yard, each step felt like it carried more weight, more purpose. He could see the bulldozer's massive arm lifting another piece of the fence into the air. The structure groaned under the force. A chunk of wood fell to the ground with a loud thud. Mark reached the street, the ground beneath his shoes rough with gravel. Karen was still standing there, her gaze lazily flicking over to him. Her smile never wavered. She watched him approach with the same calmness, the same detached amusement that made Mark want to scream. This was no accident, no misunderstanding. She knew exactly what she was doing. "What is this, Karen?" Mark's voice was tight, barely controlled. "What are you doing to my fence?" Karen didn't flinch. She took a sip of her coffee, as if the entire situation were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Oh, Mark," she said, her voice sugary sweet. "It's just a fence, safety regulations and all that. It had to go. It's been up for far too long." She shrugged as if dismissing the weight of history and the significance of the landmark that had stood for generations. "Rules are rules, Mark clenched his fists, feeling the surge of frustration rise up in him like a storm. She was unshaken, unbothered. "You see, I've got everything under control." Her eyes glinted, the same look she always wore when she knew she had the upper hand. It was the same look she gave when she handed out fines for trivial infractions, when she used her position as HOA president to manipulate, intimidate, and divide. Mark didn't respond immediately. He stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of her, the calmness in her eyes, the way she had somehow convinced herself she was untouchable. He had seen it too many times before, the way she used the HOA as her personal tool, her way of controlling the community with an iron grip. It wasn't just about the fence. It was about her need to dominate, to prove she could control every aspect of people's lives. But she had made a mistake. Mark wasn't just some homeowner who would cower before her. He wasn't going to let her get away with it this time. He had seen enough, waited long enough. And now he would act. He wasn't afraid of Karen. In fact, it was her arrogance, her inability to recognize the consequences of her actions, that gave Mark the edge. "You've made a big mistake, Karen," he said, his voice colder now. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Karen's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but she quickly masked it with her usual smugness. "We'll see about that," she replied, her tone dripping with condescension. As Mark turned to walk back to his house, the weight of his decision settled over him. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was focused. He had a plan, and Karen had just handed him the perfect opportunity. The community wouldn't let this stand. Mark wasn't going to let her win, not this time. The battle for the neighborhood was just beginning, and Mark was ready to play the long game. The sun had barely risen when Mark's world began to unravel. The soft glow of dawn had cast a peaceful hue over the neighborhood, but the stillness was shattered by a sound that made his blood run cold. It started as a low growl, the rumble of an engine turning over, but it grew louder, more menacing with each passing second. Mark's gaze snapped to the window, and there, cutting through the quiet morning, was the bulldozer. Its massive wheels churned the earth as it crept toward his historic fence, the one that had been standing for over 100 years. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He had warned them. He had done everything to make sure the fence, a piece of the neighborhood's soul, was protected. But this was worse than he had ever imagined. His hand gripped the edge of the windowsill as he watched in horror, unable to tear his eyes away from the destruction unfolding before him. The bulldozer's enormous arm swung forward, and Mark could hear the bone-rattling crack of wood splintering. The fence, a proud, weathered testament to the neighborhood's history, fell apart in seconds. It was a deliberate, calculated act, and each piece of timber that shattered seemed to strike at the very heart of the community. The historic fence, a monument to the past, was gone. Mark's stomach twisted. He wanted to scream, to rush out and stop it, but his legs felt like lead. The sudden onslaught of emotions, anger, disbelief, and betrayal, seized him all at once. He had fought for that fence, had defended its place in history, and now it was being ripped apart before his very eyes. His fists clenched as he forced himself to move. He couldn't just stand there. In a daze, Mark rushed out of the house and onto his front porch. The bulldozer kept moving, oblivious to the man standing helplessly on the steps. As the machine lurched forward, tearing into the fence's final sections, Mark's eyes locked onto a figure standing across the street, watching with an air of casual indifference. Karen, the HOA president. Mark knew the smirk that was twisting her lips was a signal of triumph. She was relishing the moment, watching the destruction of something that had been cherished by the community for over a century. Mark's jaw tightened, his body trembling with rage as he stared across the street. The pain of seeing his neighborhood's history being reduced to rubble was almost unbearable, but the sight of Karen, so composed, so smug, sent an even deeper, more bitter wave of fury through him. This wasn't just an act of destruction. It was an insult to everything that the community stood for. She was trying to prove a point, and Mark was the one she was making it against. He opened his mouth to shout, to confront her, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? What could he possibly do in the face of such brazen arrogance? Karen was so far gone in her belief that she was untouchable that she would probably just smile and dismiss him, as she always did. Mark took a deep breath, the anger bubbling up in his chest, and forced himself to look away. He had bigger plans than just a confrontation. She had made the mistake of underestimating him, and that would be her undoing. His eyes shifted to the wreckage before him, the splintered wood that had once been a proud and historical fence. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew that this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose, not just for himself, but for the whole neighborhood. Mark's resolve solidified as he turned back toward the house, stepping inside to make the phone call that would set everything in motion. The city. He had to get the city involved. A flurry of calls ensued, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed the number for city officials. It took a few frantic tries, but finally, Mark reached someone who could help. His voice was calm but urgent as he explained what had just happened. My fence, my historic fence, it's been torn down, and I know who's behind it. The HOA president, Karen. She had no right. The voice on the other end was slow to respond, but when they finally did, their words hit like a ton of bricks. Mark, I'm sorry to hear that, but you're not wrong. That fence is a city landmark, protected by local preservation laws. If Karen did this without authorization, then she's violated city law. She's in serious trouble. The words rang in his ears. Karen had gone too far. In her obsession to control everything, she had trampled over something much bigger than her petty HOA rules. She had broken the law. Mark's pulse quickened as the realization settled in. Karen hadn't just caused damage to his property. She had dragged the entire community into her web of lies and corruption. Mark didn't waste any time. He immediately began gathering evidence, a process that felt more like an instinct than a strategy. He grabbed his phone and snapped pictures of the destruction, capturing every angle, every piece of the broken fence that now lay in a tangled mess on his front lawn. He documented the wreckage with the precision of a man on a mission. Each photo was a weapon, each one more damning than the last. He could feel the gears of his plan beginning to turn. But it didn't stop there. Mark knew he needed more. The pictures alone wouldn't be enough. He needed hard evidence that would tie Karen's actions to something bigger, something far more criminal. As the hours passed, he dug through city records, cross-referencing the neighborhood's historic preservation files. It didn't take long before he found it. Clear documentation confirming the status of the fence as a protected landmark. This wasn't just a fight over property. It was a legal matter that could potentially ruin Karen. As he sat at his desk, piecing together the puzzle, Mark's mind raced. Karen had assumed that her position as HOA president would shield her from the consequences of her actions. But she was wrong. This was no longer about a fence. It was about corruption, manipulation, and the power of one man's determination to expose the truth. Mark wasn't just fighting for a fence anymore. He was fighting for justice, for the neighborhood that had been betrayed, and for the dignity of every homeowner who had suffered under Karen's tyrannical rule. But there was something else simmering beneath the surface, a cold, steely desire for retribution. Karen had thought she could break him, humiliate him, and bend him to her will. But Mark wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to make sure she paid for every wrong she had ever committed. As the days passed, Mark's case grew stronger. He gathered witness statements from neighbors who had experienced Karen's bullying firsthand, neighbors who had been coerced into paying unnecessary fines, threatened with legal action, or silenced by her oppressive rule. It was clear now. Karen's corruption wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a calculated effort to line her own pockets and maintain control over the entire community. The more Mark uncovered, the more he realized just how far Karen had gone, and just how many people she had wronged. Then, one evening, Mark received an unexpected call. It was from a local journalist, someone who had caught wind of the fence demolition and the growing story surrounding Karen's illegal actions. "Mark, I've been hearing rumors. It seems like your case has caught the attention of more than just the city. I've got sources telling me about some serious financial discrepancies in the HOA's records, transactions that don't add up. I think we're talking about something much bigger here." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Financial discrepancies? He had already uncovered a few minor irregularities, but this was something else. The journalist offered to meet him the next day and promised to bring a dossier of documents that would blow the case wide open. Mark's stomach twisted with anticipation. Everything was falling into place. He had no doubt that Karen's days of hiding behind her HOA presidency were numbered. He had her cornered, and there was nowhere left for her to run. She had made her mistake, and now Mark would make sure she paid for it. The next day, the journalist arrived with a thick stack of documents. Mark's eyes widened as he flipped through them, his hands trembling. The discrepancies were worse than he had imagined. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned off from HOA funds, funneled into personal accounts under Karen's name. Mark could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about exposing a criminal mastermind. With this new evidence in hand, Mark knew it was time to strike. The time for quiet preparation was over. He had everything he needed to bring Karen down. But even as he prepared for the confrontation, a feeling of unease settled in his chest. He wasn't just up against Karen anymore. He was up against a system, one that had been built on fear, manipulation, and corruption. Mark wasn't just fighting for a fence. He was fighting for the soul of his community. The storm was coming, and Mark was ready to face it head-on. The morning of the HOA meeting arrived, and Mark had prepared for it as he always had, calm, collected, and focused. The world around him seemed quieter than usual, the birds outside his window almost as if they knew what was about to happen. He dressed in his usual work clothes, neat but not flashy. Today wasn't about drawing attention to himself. It was about making sure that Karen would no longer be able to hide her dark secrets. The weight of everything he had uncovered was heavy, but it didn't stop him. He was steady, his every move was calculated. He knew the HOA meeting was more than just a chance to address the destruction of the fence. That issue, while important, was merely the tip of the iceberg. Mark wasn't just angry over the loss of a 100-year-old piece of history. He was angry about the people Karen had hurt, the lies she had spread, and the years of fear she had instilled in the community. This was about more than just making Karen pay. It was about making sure the neighborhood could finally heal. The community deserved to know the truth, even if Karen had spent years carefully guarding her secrets. Mark's mind briefly flashed back to the countless hours he had spent gathering evidence. It hadn't been easy. He had hired a lawyer with experience in historic preservation laws, someone who understood the complex city regulations that protected landmarks like his fence. Every conversation with the lawyer had brought him closer to the certainty that Karen had made a monumental mistake. When he had dug deeper into city records, Mark found the confirmation he needed. The fence had been listed in the city's historical registry. It wasn't just an old fence, it was a protected landmark. That discovery had sent a rush of adrenaline through him. Karen had crossed a line she hadn't even known existed. But the fence was just the beginning. Mark's investigations into Karen's activities had uncovered something far more sinister. He had always suspected that Karen's control over the neighborhood wasn't limited to petty fines and threats. As he sifted through HOA financial records, something had stood out, a series of small, seemingly insignificant transactions. But Mark's gut told him something wasn't right. It wasn't long before he realized that the irregularities were far from accidental. Money meant for community improvements, for neighborhood events and upkeep, was being funneled into Karen's personal accounts. Mark had been horrified. She wasn't just abusing her position for petty power trips. She was stealing from the very people who trusted her. With every new discovery, the case against Karen grew stronger. Mark knew he couldn't bring her down alone. He'd reached out to other neighbors who had suffered under Karen's rule, people who had witnessed her manipulation firsthand. The accounts were eerily similar. Karen had bullied them into silence, made them feel small, threatened them with fines, and even turned the neighborhood against them. The more he heard, the more he realized just how widespread her influence had been. But the most chilling realization came when Mark understood how blind Karen had been to her own actions. She believed herself untouchable, invincible, and now she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The community hall where the HOA meetings were held felt oppressive that day. The windows were small, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the rows of folding chairs looked uncomfortable, as though designed to keep people in line. Mark entered early, moving silently through the room as Karen sat at the head of the table, her posture perfect, a smug smile playing on her lips. She was surrounded by her loyalists, the few neighbors who had either been too afraid or too apathetic to stand up to her. As Mark moved to the back of the room, Karen's eyes flickered toward him, a brief flash of recognition passing over her face. But she quickly dismissed him, returning to her little world of power, certain that nothing could shake her position. The meeting proceeded as usual, Karen presiding with an iron fist, dismissing any concerns that weren't in line with her agenda. Mark remained still, waiting, watching. His heart raced in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew the time would come when he could no longer stay silent. He couldn't wait for the perfect moment. It had already arrived. As the meeting wore on, Mark felt the tension in the room build, the quiet murmur of complaints and protests growing louder. He rose slowly, drawing the attention of the room. Karen's eyes narrowed as she saw him approach the front, her smile faltering just slightly. She wasn't used to people challenging her. Mark placed the stack of documents on the table in front of him, one sheet at a time as the silence thickened. "I'm not here to argue about another fine or complaint." Mark's voice rang clear, calm, and firm. "I'm here to expose the truth. The truth about what's been happening in this neighborhood. The truth about what Karen has been doing behind closed doors." The room grew still. Karen's expression twisted into something between disbelief and fury, but Mark didn't look at her. He didn't need to. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of his neighbors, some uncertain, others angry, all now fully focused on him. He pulled out the photos first, showing the wreckage of the fence, the city records proving it was a protected landmark, and the legal documents that confirmed its status. The murmurs started, soft at first, but then grew louder as people began to connect the dots. They weren't just dealing with a petty dispute, they were dealing with someone who had deliberately broken the law. But Mark wasn't done. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small laptop, opening it with deliberate slowness. The footage began to play, showing Karen manipulating the HOA funds, approving fraudulent transactions, and funneling money from the community into her personal bank accounts. The images on the screen were undeniable. There was no denying what she had done. The room gasped collectively. Some of the neighbors stared in shock, others in disbelief. Karen's face turned ashen, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to find the words to defend herself. But none came. Mark's voice cut through the growing chaos, steady and unwavering. "We have witnesses," he said, his gaze finally meeting Karen's. "And we have proof. Your reign is over, Karen. The community knows the truth now." It was then that the cracks in her composure began to show. Karen stood up suddenly, knocking over her chair in a rush of motion. "This is all lies. You can't." Her voice trembled, a stark contrast to the confident, controlling persona she had so carefully cultivated. But it didn't matter. The evidence was there. The truth had been laid bare. The room erupted into chaos. Those who had once supported Karen now turned on her, their faces filled with anger, confusion, and betrayal. Others were silent, unsure of what to do. But Mark knew it didn't matter. The tide had turned. The proof had been laid out. Karen had no way to escape this. Within days, Karen's arrest was inevitable. The city moved swiftly to dismantle the corrupt HOA board, and legal action was taken against her for the destruction of the historic landmark. The community, once divided by fear, was united in their support for Mark and the restoration of the neighborhood. Karen's home was sold to cover the damages she had caused, and the money was used to restore the very fence she had torn down. The old piece of history stood tall again, a powerful symbol of justice and the community's resilience. Mark watched as the fence was rebuilt, the sun setting behind it, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink. The fence, once a symbol of Karen's tyranny, now stood as a permanent reminder of the power of standing up for what was right. With Karen gone, the community slowly began to heal. The HOA was restructured into a fair, democratic body, and the neighbors, once afraid to speak up, now found the courage to do so. Mark stood on his porch, looking out at the restored fence. His heart swelled with pride, not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. The journey had been long, and at times, it had seemed like an uphill battle. But they had done it. They had taken back control. And as Mark gazed at the horizon, he knew this was just the beginning. The community was stronger than ever, and he had played a part in making it that way. It wasn't just a fence. It was a testament to the power of one man's quiet determination, the strength of the community, and the unshakable belief that justice would always prevail. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, but it highlights the real issues of property rights, overreach, and the importance of preserving historical landmarks. This scenario serves as a reminder that ignorance of the law is no excuse, and protecting our heritage should always be a priority. Our goal is to raise awareness, provoke thought, and encourage respect for history and the law.